I never expected my life to take a turn like this, but the first day with Alice was simple enough. I was hired to take care of her, an elderly woman suffering from dementia. Alice lived in a beautiful house, a mansion almost, with a pool and a sprawling backyard. Her son, however, seemed like he was always on edge. He warned me before I even stepped foot in her house. She can be difficult, aggressive sometimes. She wanders, doesn't remember things, and tries to grab knives if she's upset. Just be careful. I shrugged it off, thinking how hard could it be? She was old and forgetful, but I was there to help. At first, Alice seemed nothing like the woman her son had described. She was polite and friendly. Her eyes were kind, though sometimes distant, as if she were seeing something far away. She thanked me when I helped her with her breakfast, and she even asked about my day. Simple things, but there was something about her gaze, like she was watching me closely, waiting for something. The first few hours went smoothly. I helped her with her daily routine, making sure she took her medication and was comfortable. We went outside to the yard, where the sun warmed the lawn and birds chirped nearby. She smiled at the garden, then at me, almost as if she were in a memory she couldn't quite reach. But then things began to change. Around noon, Alice's mood shifted. One moment, she was sitting calmly by the window, and the next, her voice cracked through the silence. "I see them," she muttered, her hands shaking as she gripped the armrest. I asked who she meant, but she didn't respond, her eyes wide and unblinking. They're coming for me," she whispered, her voice so quiet it was almost a hiss. I tried to calm her down, but she pulled away from me, suddenly furious. "Don't touch me," she screamed, her face twisting with something I couldn't quite understand. Fear? Anger? The way she looked at me like I was a stranger made my skin crawl. I tried to step back, but she was already heading for the kitchen. I heard the drawer slide open, and before I could stop her, she had a knife in her hand, its silver blade glinting in the dim light. "I need to protect myself," she muttered under her breath. I rushed forward, heart pounding, and grabbed her hand, gently taking the knife from her. She didn't fight me, but she stared at me with those strange, unblinking eyes. "They're here," she said again, quieter this time, almost like a prayer. Shaken, I decided to call her son, Dorian. He answered quickly, almost like he was waiting for my call. "She's been worse lately," he said, his voice tight. "I've been looking for a place for her, somewhere safer. But it's hard, you know? These places, they don't understand." I tried to keep my voice steady. "I don't know how much longer I can keep her safe." She tried to grab a knife. She said, "They're here." What does that mean? Dorian was silent for a moment, and when he spoke again, his words were careful. "It's just the disease. Sometimes she thinks people are after her. I'm sorry she's scaring you, but we're doing everything we can." The rest of that day was a blur. Alice oscillated between calm and violent, sweet and angry. She seemed lost in her own world, but when she looked at me, it felt like she saw something else, something more. Her movements became erratic, like she was chasing something unseen. She would cry, then laugh, then yell at me to leave her alone. At one point, she tried to leave the house, pulling at the door like it was the only thing holding her together. When I'd finally thought the day was over, Dorian called again to let me know he'd found a facility for Alice, a special place that could care for her needs. I helped Alice pack her things. She didn't fight me as I laid out her clothes, though her hands trembled. She kept muttering, almost to herself, "They're coming. You'll leave me too." It was hard to say goodbye, though I knew she'd be in a safer place. A part of me wanted to believe Alice would be okay, that she wasn't as lost as she seemed. But that night, after she was gone, I stayed in her empty house for a while, listening to the quiet. I thought about her last words, about the way she'd stared at me in those final moments. The house felt too still, too empty. As I walked through the yard, I thought I heard something, a whisper maybe, coming from the pool. I froze, straining to listen, but nothing. I sighed, brushing it off as my imagination. Then I heard it again, a low, familiar whisper calling my name from the shadows. I couldn't explain why I suddenly felt so cold, but the darkness in the backyard seemed to stretch deeper, darker, more alive. And somewhere, in the quiet of the house, I thought I saw her again. Alice, standing at the window, staring out. She didn't smile. She didn't move. Just watching, waiting. It was supposed to be a fun night. Just a simple New Year's Eve party with a group of friends, some music, drinks, and laughs. I mean, what could go wrong, right? But that night, the house felt off. Not in an obvious way, but just a subtle shift in the air that no one could quite place. I remember standing there, watching the clock tick down to midnight, the echoes of our celebration filling the room when it started. The sound, a soft creak, like a floorboard giving way under pressure. At first, we all just brushed it off as the house settling, but then it came again, louder, more deliberate. "Did you guys hear that?" Kelsey asked, her eyes wide as she glanced around the room. I wasn't sure why, but I could feel my stomach tighten. Everyone else seemed to be ignoring it, lost in their own conversations. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "Probably the floorboards," I suggested, trying to sound calm. But even as I said it, the creaking came again, followed by a faint, rhythmic scraping sound. I turned to the others. "What the hell is that?" "Let's check the basement," Will said, ever the brave one in the group. He grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and waved it around like it was no big deal. We all followed him down the stairs, the noise growing louder with each step we took. The basement door creaked open slowly, and the first thing that hit us was the cold. It was colder than usual down there, and for some reason, the light seemed dimmer, flickering like it was struggling to stay on. There, in the far corner of the room, was an old wooden rocking chair. It was rocking by itself. I didn't know why, but my body froze. The sound of the creaking chair was unnerving, like the whole room was alive, holding its breath. Kelsey moved forward first, hesitating for a moment before she reached out and touched the armrest. "Maybe it's just a draft," she said, her voice faltering, but as her hand brushed the wood, the rocking chair lurched forward violently, as though it had a mind of its own. She jerked back with a gasp, and we all stared at it, too scared to move. "Is anyone going to stop it?" Will asked, his voice suddenly thin, unsure. I looked at him, then at the chair. Without thinking, I walked over and tried to grab the back of it. The moment my hand touched the cold wood, the chair jerked again, hard, as if it was fighting back. My fingers slipped, and I stumbled back. We all stood there stunned until the chair stopped rocking on its own. "We're not going to mess with this," Kelsey said, her voice shaky, and I agreed. "Let's just go back upstairs." Back in the warmth of the living room, the sound of the chair's creaking had stopped, but something didn't sit right with me. I kept thinking about it, the way it rocked on its own, the unnatural strength of it. I kept looking at the basement door, the uneasy feeling crawling under my skin. Will must have noticed because he walked over to me. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. "Yeah," I lied. "It just doesn't feel right. Like we disturbed something." That's when he did something I never expected. "I'm going back to check on the chair," he said, almost defiantly. "If it's still rocking, I'll stop it." I didn't stop him. I didn't think I could, even if I wanted to. I just nodded, feeling an icy chill creep down my spine. The party went on around me, but I couldn't shake the dread. Every time the clock ticked, I found myself glancing toward the basement door. And then, an hour later, Will came back. But it wasn't the same. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. His hands were trembling as he gripped the doorframe. "It's worse," he whispered. "It's louder. It won't stop. I can't stop it. I tried everything." We all rushed to him, but the moment we stepped into the hallway, the house fell deathly silent. No music, no chatter, just the deep creak of something from below. We froze. Then, without a word, we all ran back downstairs, hearts pounding. The basement light flickered again, and there it was. The chair, moving violently, screeching against the wooden floor. But this time, the sound wasn't just the creak of wood. It was like something was screaming through the chair. A low, eerie howl that sent chills through my bones. Will grabbed my arm and we pulled back, running up the stairs like our lives depended on it. We didn't stop until we were all back in the living room, gasping for air, too terrified to even speak. When we woke up the next morning, we found the house was quiet. Too quiet. The basement was empty. The chair was gone. We searched the entire house. Every closet, every room, the attic. But there was nothing. No rocking chair. It had vanished. We didn't know what to think. The house felt wrong. We couldn't explain what happened. Maybe it was the ghost of the house. Maybe it was something else. But we all knew one thing. Whatever it was still out there. And it wasn't finished with us. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, and I had just left the cafe on the corner where I often went to read or write. The sun was dipping lower in the sky, painting the streets in a golden hue, but the breeze carried a bite that hinted at the coming evening chill. I pulled my jacket tighter around me as I walked home, the crunch of leaves under my boots the only sound accompanying my thoughts. I wasn't far from my apartment when I noticed him. He was tall, his broad shoulders filling out the dark hoodie he wore, and his hands were buried in its pockets. He was standing on the sidewalk ahead, glancing around as though looking for something, or someone. I felt a flicker of unease, but brushed it aside. People stopped for all kinds of reasons, didn't they? Maybe he was waiting for a friend or trying to figure out directions. As I got closer, he turned to me with a smile. It wasn't friendly. It was practiced, calculated. I felt it before I saw it, an instinct deep in my gut that told me to keep walking. But then he spoke, his voice low and smooth. "Hey, excuse me," he said, stepping closer. "I'm lost. Could you help me find the nearest bus station?" I hesitated, the polite part of me warring with the instinct screaming for me to leave. But his tone wasn't aggressive, and for all I knew, he genuinely needed help. So, against my better judgment, I stopped. Sure," I said, forcing a smile. "It's a few blocks down that way." I gestured vaguely, hoping he'd take the hint and move along. But he didn't. Instead, he leaned closer, his smile widening as his eyes scanned me. "I'm not from around here. Could you show me? Just a minute of your time." There was something about the way he said it that sent a chill racing down my spine. My breath hitched, and I stepped back. "I'm sorry. I really have to get going." Before I could finish, his hand shot out and clamped around my arm. His grip was like steel, his fingers digging into my skin. Panic flooded me as he yanked me toward a nearby alley, his movements fast and forceful. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears, drowning out the distant sounds of traffic. "Let go!" I screamed, twisting and pulling against his grasp. My voice echoed off the walls of the alley, but no one came. It was as if the world had disappeared, leaving just the two of us in this terrifying moment. He didn't speak, didn't say anything at all. That silence was somehow more terrifying than if he'd shouted or threatened me. I could feel his strength, the inevitability of being overpowered, and it fueled my desperation. I kicked out, my boot catching his shin. He grunted but didn't loosen his hold. My free hand clawed at his face, and my nails raked across his cheek. The force of my panic seemed to lend me strength I didn't know I had, and I screamed again, this time louder, rawer. "Help! Somebody help me!" My foot found its mark again, this time harder, and he stumbled. That momentary lapse was all I needed. I twisted with everything I had, wrenching my arm free from his grip. My body acted on instinct, and I bolted, the sound of my boots slapping the pavement mixing with my ragged breaths. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The thought of seeing him behind me, chasing me, was too much. I ran until my legs burned, my lungs screamed, and tears streamed down my face. Ahead, a brightly lit convenience store came into view, its fluorescent lights a beacon of safety. I burst through the doors, startling the clerk behind the counter. "There's a man!" I gasped, leaning against the counter, trying to catch my breath. He tried to grab me. "Please, call the police." The clerk's eyes widened, and he immediately reached for the phone. My body trembled uncontrollably as I leaned against the counter, the adrenaline that had carried me this far starting to ebb, leaving me shaken and vulnerable. When the police arrived, I gave them my statement, recounting every horrifying detail. But the man was gone, vanished into the night like a shadow. They promised to search for him, to patrol the area. But deep down, I knew he wouldn't be caught. He was like a phantom, slipping through cracks in the world. That night, I sat in my apartment, every creak and whisper of the wind outside setting my nerves on edge. I kept the lights on, my doors locked and bolted. Even now, days later, I still glance over my shoulder, my heart leaping at the sight of any man in a dark hoodie. I escaped, but he's still out there, somewhere. We moved into the house on a crisp autumn morning. It was a tall, narrow structure, weathered by years of wind and rain, with 9 floors stacked like secrets upon secrets. The realtor called it charming and full of character, but my partner Elise and I just saw an opportunity, a place big enough for our growing family. Our daughter Mira loved the attic room on the 9th floor, with its slanted ceilings and tiny round window that framed the moon perfectly at night. The first night was quiet, but not in a peaceful way. It was the kind of silence that feels like it's waiting. Elise brushed it off when I mentioned it. "It's just an old house," she said, smiling. "Old houses make noise." The first incident happened 3 days in. Mira came downstairs pale-faced, clutching her stuffed rabbit. "Someone was walking in the hallway last night," she whispered. I glanced at Elise, but she was busy unpacking. "It's probably just the wind," I told her. Mira nodded, but I could tell she didn't believe me. To be honest, I wasn't sure I believed myself. By the end of the week, the small things had become impossible to ignore. Doors that were shut would be open when we came back. Objects moved from one side of the room to the other. The creaks in the floorboards grew louder at night, sounding almost like deliberate footsteps. And then there were the whispers. Soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Elise started keeping the TV on, even when no one was watching, just to drown out the sound. The shadows came next. They didn't belong to us. They would dart across the edges of our vision, vanishing the moment we turned our heads. One night, as I was brushing my teeth, I saw something in the bathroom mirror. A figure standing just behind me. It was gone before I could turn around. My heart raced as I stared into the empty space, the toothpaste foaming at my mouth. I didn't tell Elise. But Elise had her own stories. She found Mira talking to someone in her room, someone who wasn't there. Mira called her the lady from the window. Elise said Mira was just lonely and imagining things, but the look on her face told me she was scared. And so was I. One night, Elise shook me awake. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I strained my ears. It was faint, but it was there. A low, rhythmic thumping, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. We followed the sound down to the living room, but when we flipped on the light, nothing was out of place. The sound stopped. We stood there in silence, holding our breath, until we heard Mira scream from upstairs. We sprinted up the narrow staircase, my heart pounding in my chest. Mira was huddled in the corner of her room, pointing at the window. "She was here," she sobbed. "The lady, she was looking at me." I ran to the window and threw it open, but the street below was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching us. That was the night Elise said we should leave. "This house isn't right," she said. Her voice cracked, and I could see the fear in her eyes. "It's like it doesn't want us here." We started packing the next morning, but the house didn't make it easy. The shadows were more frequent, darting boldly across the rooms in broad daylight. The whispers became louder, almost angry. It felt like the walls were closing in. Mira wouldn't go into her room at all, insisting that the lady was there, waiting. I didn't argue. I didn't want to go in either. The last night, we slept, or tried to, in the living room, surrounded by our packed boxes. Around midnight, a sound jolted us awake. It was loud, sharp, and unmistakable. Someone pounding on the door at the bottom of the staircase. Thud. Thud, thud. My chest tightened as I realized it was coming closer, floor by floor, one slow step at a time. Elise clung to Mira, her face pale as ash. I grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, useless but comforting, and waited, my heart hammering. The pounding stopped just outside the living room. The door creaked open, but no one was there. That was it. We didn't wait for morning. We grabbed what we could and ran. The drive to the motel was silent, all of us too shaken to speak. Mira fell asleep clutching her rabbit, her little face streaked with tears. We never went back. The movers packed the rest of our things, and I didn't care what they thought when I refused to step inside. We lost money on the house, but it didn't matter. Nothing was worth what we went through. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers, soft and accusing. I'll never forget the way that house made me feel. Like we were intruders in a place that was never meant for the living.